Well, good evening, and thank you for those who are joining us online as well. Appreciate having everyone with us. We continue our schematic series tonight, going through a Russian novel, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Jordan, take it away.
All right, good evening to everyone. This is, again, I was joking about last week that my selection for this whole schematics course has been a little more somber works and a little more serious works, as opposed to maybe the ones that Clay was able to present were a little more uplifting. But this is definitely a novel that is uplifting. It has a very positive Christian message, but it takes a lot of work to get there. And that is the meat of the novel, is the work that it takes to reach that positive ending. There's a saying that some people have in fiction: you have to earn your happy ending. And these characters definitely do a lot of work, and some of them don't quite make it all the way there, but some of them do it. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Before we get started, I did want to go through just a second. Obviously, there is a lot going on in Russia right now, in terms of both internally in their own country and around the world. Obviously, there are things in every culture that we don't agree with 100%. It's not our culture, but it's something that other people have worked to produce. It's the argument of their life. And so obviously, not speaking about like the way Russian politics are right now, but in terms of their historical novels, Dostoevsky should not be taken to be an emblem of today's politics. He was writing in a separate time. Now, he had beliefs that we might not necessarily agree with, and some of them we agree with more than we might even be comfortable with, but he has a few beliefs that are definitely always worth talking about. And just the country that he happened to be born in shouldn't impact anything about his applicability to our lives. So for this entire presentation, all of the artwork that I've used is from Russian painters, who a lot of them would have been his contemporaries working about the same time. I really don't think it's ever a good idea to censor an entire people. That's not good. You engage with them, engage with their ideas. And again, look at him separate from what's happening in the world today. We're talking about a person who lived over 100 years ago. Let's engage with him and not with what's going on in the world today. Now, the image that I've used here is maybe what you might think of if you've heard of Crime and Punishment and you haven't read the book. Whenever I was a boy and I had heard of this book referenced and I didn't know anything about it, I just assumed it was a book about the Russian penal system. Now, at this time, Russia had a system of punishment that was a little bit different than we might be familiar with in terms of prison and punishment today. Russia is, of course, a very big country. Large portions of the country are really not easily inhabitable, but on either side, they are interested in people living there. On the western side of Russia, you have the more closer to Europe. A lot of work is done there. The capital is over there. On the eastern side, or what we would say is the eastern side, all the way over, touching the Pacific Ocean. So the problem is you have to get railway lines to get people from one half to the other. Nobody wants to live in the middle in Siberia. So the work camps were a way around that. The Russia of Dostoevsky's time and earlier, and even a little bit later, definitely used people to move out to this inhospitable, very cold portion of the country to live and work. And now they were prisoners, and they would have to report back and go to prison each evening in sort of a barrack style. But then during the day, they would go out and work on the railroad, similar to how we used to have prisoners if you have like the stereotypical chain gang, people out building a highway or something. So very similar to that. And whenever I was a boy, I hadn't read the book yet, this is what I thought it was about. I thought, well, he's making a commentary about the prison system of his day. Not so much. The book is really different and really hardly interacts with either, the crime itself occurs very briefly, and we'll talk about what it is, why it is, and how that all unfolds. And the punishment in terms of the corporal physical punishment that the individual suffers comes at the very, 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 very end of the book. Everything interesting is in between. It's very much a personal psychological novel dealing with why people act the way they do. And so the actual physical backdrop is very dramatic and might interest us. But again, it's really a novel about human emotion, human actions, and why people are driven to do the things they do. Maybe if I can, there we go. So looking at the author, we'll get a little bit of background. A lot of him is in all of his work. So understanding this individual, understanding Fyodor Dostoevsky is important to understand his characters and, again, why they act the way they do. He is not so much an allegorical writer, that we talked about allegory a little bit with Clay and with Pilgrim's Progress. These individual characters are definitely characters that stand on their own merits. They don't need to exist as a straw man, but they definitely illustrate concepts that Dostoevsky either espoused or was combating or had just seen around the world. And so they illustrate little different points of his life and his times. So Dostoevsky had a very interesting life, especially early on, a very dramatic life, and a life that almost ended very quickly for him, but ended up giving us someone who was very rich in terms of his personal history, and he was able, again, to channel that into his writing. So he, again, this is a quote that I think really sums up what makes him different than something we might read. Modern American literature might not look like this, but a quote from near the end of the novel: "Pain and suffering are always inevitable for a large intelligence and a deep heart. The really great men must, I think, have great sadness on earth." Whenever I was preparing for this, I saw someone had made a joke where they had said that in English literature, you get, I will die for my honor. And in French literature, you get, I will die for my love. And in American literature, you get, I'll die for my freedom. And then in Russian literature, you get, I don't think I want to die. I don't think I'm ready yet. And so you get sort of that angst and that anxiety that is, again, not so much dismissed, but is richly, richly explored. So why do people feel this way? What drives people to feel like this, and how can we work around it? Again, not pretending that pain and suffering don't exist, but rather intelligently working with it. So Dostoevsky did not even live to be 60. He died whenever he was 59, a couple months before his 60th birthday. His health was always not great. And again, some of his characters, I was like, why is he making these characters so sickly? They're always falling over themselves. They're always fainting. Some of them have seizures in the middle of their sentences. Why is this happening? And it comes from a lot of his life. A lot of his characters reflect his own struggles with his health. He definitely was someone who was never in great shape physically, but of course was able to have a really productive career in spite of that. Now, initially, he was not a writer. His family was what we might call like upper middle class or lower upper class. They had money of their own. And importantly, I think, to his psychological state and where he was and everything, they did own serfs in terms of their family estate. And we'll get to what they were and what that means a little bit later. But his family was wealthy enough. His parents were doctors. And so they were able to send him to a military school, but it was a tuition-free military school. So again, he still had that upper class education, but not so much in the way that he was, born into privilege or anything. So again, really not what you would expect out of a writer like this. Now, he did not fit in his military academy, and even at that young age, he was preoccupied with religion. He was preoccupied with psychology, with talking with other people, working through them. Why were they acting the way they were acting? With trying to minister to people and help them. So again, someone who was deeply religiously motivated, even from a young age, and that just explodes towards the later half of his life, and he becomes a very religiously motivated individual. So he really paints a picture about social pressures, social problems, things that compel people to act a way that they would not have ordinarily acted. So I am who I am because of when I'm born and where I'm born. That's true for all of us. So Dostoevsky is asking, why? How do those pieces fall into place, and why are you the way you are because of that? So with Crime and Punishment, we see one snapshot of this critique. He is looking at St. Petersburg, at a time around when he would have lived, at this point, maybe the 1860s. And he is looking at an individual who is compelled to act in a way that he would not have ordinarily acted. And we'll get to that in just a little bit. So his early life, again, as I said, he was looking at a tuition-free military college. He was a military engineer, and he actually did okay as a military engineer. He didn't like it, but he did it. That was his job for quite a while, but his health, again, was never good. His first epileptic fit occurred whenever he learned the death of his father. He kind of collapsed and had an epileptic fit. Those would plague him for the rest of his life. And again, his characters, they look a little odd in terms of his preoccupation with describing their various health ailments, in terms of them kind of falling apart over the course of the novels. That takes a little bit of getting used to. But again, as you kind of see that he is showing life as he knows it, it makes a lot more sense, and it makes them uniquely vulnerable. Again, his characters are usually not in their best stage whenever we encounter them. Now, at the time, again, he lived pretty well. Right after his graduation from the military academy, went into service as a military engineer, did okay. His income was pretty good. His family's income was pretty good. And so he was, again, maybe something close to upper class. Now, his first problem really with gambling occurred at this time. He was known to really frequent roulette tables and would lose relatively large sums of money relatively quickly doing that. And so he actually turned to writing to help to pay that off. And we'll get to that in just a little bit. Again, definitely a bad decision and definitely bad for him personally, but great for society and history that he needed money. And so we'll talk about that in just a little bit. This is a sketch that one of his classmates at the military school made of him whenever he was a young man. That individual did go on to become a painter. We have some more of his works in the rest of the slideshow. So interesting that somebody who knew him from that age kind of stuck around for a while. So early life in exile, you'll see that these slides are titled, he was exiled. So again, that system of exile and that system of being forced to work in Siberia, that's something that Dostoevsky was intimately familiar with because he spent about 5 years in Siberia. Now, his first novel, again, was to pay off his gambling debts. He just needed money, and so he was already kind of experimenting with writing, and so this pushed him to publish a work, kind of gave him, put his back up against the wall. You need to make money quickly. Go ahead and publish this work. It was very well received. His first novel, Poor Folk, it was about two individuals who were both at the bottom of society, and it's a series of correspondence between them. And again, very interesting book that we don't really have time to talk about today, but still saw success in his life, and so kind of pushed him into the scene as a writer. As a writer, he resigned his military post so he could focus more on his writing. Again, I'm sure he was a great engineer, but we are glad that he did that. Now, what really changes his life is he gets involved in a literary circle that is sort of an intellectual style, kind of what we're doing here a little bit, where people would meet to discuss works that are being written. And again, we have the freedom to do that here, and no one can come and arrest us for doing what we're doing here tonight. But in Tsarist Russia, this is very different. Now, in Dostoevsky's time, this is still the reign of Nicholas II at first, I think. And so he was dealing with the aftermath of something called the Decembrist Revolt. We don't have time to get into that, but that was an attempted revolt against the Tsar by the intellectual classes. And so people were still very skeptical of the intellectuals and the elites. And so Dostoevsky and his literary circle, they did read books that were seen as critical of the Tsar. And so that was seen as sort of a revolutionary act. Dostoevsky never denied reading the books, but he did say, I was reading them as literature. I wasn't reading them and trying to stir up a political sentiment. Some of the other people in this circle definitely were, but Dostoevsky said, yeah, I read them, but I'm not a political revolutionary. Okay, well, that's not good enough. He still ended up going to Siberia. Now, interestingly enough, the prison that he stayed in while he was in Siberia has been retrofitted as a hotel. It's still there, the same building, and you can stay there in the same little rooms that he stayed in, which is a little funny, but it is a hotel now. Now, he was in Siberia for 5 years, and while he was there, because again, he was flagged for being a potential rebel, he was flagged as kind of a high value criminal, a very dangerous man. And so again, even though he's a writer and not very good health, he was flagged as a dangerous criminal. He spent the entire 5 years in shackles, and so was not able to freely move around as much as some of the other prisoners were, and he was denied access to any literature except for a New Testament Bible. He was not allowed to read anything because, again, that's what got him in the first place. So again, for him, having the New Testament was definitely not a problem because he was at the time, again, very deeply religious and would become even more religious as his life progressed. So after he comes out of prison, he comes back and begins publishing again. And sort of amazingly, that's not the end of his career. People don't write him off. People are very interested in him. And he comes back and he writes something called The House of the Dead. The House of the Dead is, again, a psychological look at the different kinds of people he encountered while he was in the prison camps. Some people are hardened criminals who could kill without a second thought. Some people spent the entire time they were in Siberia in anguish over the crimes they'd committed. So what makes those two people different? Some of the guards are very concerned with the people in their care. I want to take care of these people. Yes, they're criminals, but I have to keep them safe. Some of the guards love beating on the criminals, and they want to hurt them to exercise their power over them. So how can you have such different people all living in the same little village? Shouldn't they all be kind of the same person? Well, no. And so the House of the Dead really plays that out. And again, this is some of the first information that the Russian population at large would have had about the prison camps. And so again, maybe a sensational novel there, but again, puts him right back on the literary map almost as soon as he gets out of prison, which that's very different. Now, before he was sent to Siberian exile, they did almost execute him. This is something he was not waiting in prison and then a letter of reprieve came. He was literally at the square with the drum roll rolling, about to be shot for his reading of these anti-Tsarist books, and then a reprieve came down. This is another sketch by the same individual who I believe that sketch was put out in a newspaper at the time. And again, this is the individuals in his circle about to be shot with seconds counting down until the reprieve came. So he was ready to be killed for what he had done before he was sent off. And so again, very dramatic, and the idea of living that closely to death does feature in his works a little bit. So whenever he comes back, again, has a very full literary career after his exile. He comes back and is in and out of Russia itself. He takes a very extended honeymoon and writes with his second wife whenever he's in Europe, and does a lot of work there. He publishes a really full portfolio. All of his works are very notable, and we'll get to them in just a second. And again, during the second half of his life, Russia is also changing. The system of serfdom is abolished. We'll talk about serfdom in just a little bit and what that means for Russians and what they thought of it and what they thought of the changes that were happening in their country. But again, so it is Alexander II. So it must have been Nicholas II who was before. But in Alexander II, again, Russia is changing. Russia is modernizing. And very important, Russia starts to think of itself, do we want to westernize or do we want to go our own way? Now, this is something we'll get into really in depth later on, but Russia has a very obvious difference with, we say us in the West, in that where the predominant faith in Europe at the time is, of course, the Catholic Church, and I guess still nominally would be, whereas in Russia, it is the Eastern Orthodox and Russian Orthodox Church that is dominant. So even saying, well, we are all Christians kind of means something a little bit different from the Russian perspective, looking over here to the West. He really ended his career with a huge publication, something called The Diary of a Writer, was sort of a bundle of publications with his works, and he is able to distribute those and become very successful even at the end of his career. His health did deteriorate again before he's even 60. He had a group of seizures pretty close together and unfortunately did die of a pulmonary embolism, was very sick toward the end of his life. But at the end, he did live long enough to gather his family together. He did two things. First of all, he told his wife, I love you, I always love you, I've always been faithful to you, which is a little funny. Apparently, it's noted that he was something of a ladies' man, which again, if you go back to the images of him, that's kind of hard to imagine, but he was kind of a very specific denial there to tell his wife, I've always been faithful to you, right at the end. So I don't know what else was going on there, but wish them the best. In any case, he also gathered his children to him, and he had them read the tale of the prodigal son, and so able to reflect on that with his family. Some of his last words before he lost lucidity was a quotation of the verses outlined there in Matthew through the baptism of Christ. Now, his influence is enormous, not only on Russia at the time, but also in European and Russian writers who would follow him. I've listed here Freud, Kafka, Hermann Hesse is a German writer that really looks at individualism as well, and then Friedrich Nietzsche, who again comes up with the concept of nihilism that we might have touched on before. What we'll get into here is that Dostoevsky does not like nihilism, and Crime and Punishment is really an anti-nihilist book. So how did he influence Nietzsche? Again, they're both arguing different sides of the spectrum of individualism, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. Some of his other works, again, the publication of Crime and Punishment on the spectrum would have been, I think, 1866. But these are some other works that definitely each would deserve a presentation on their own, but I've summarized them here. Notes from Underground is a very short book. If you're looking for just a little lightning strike of what Dostoevsky is like and what his writing style can be, this is a sort of a humorous look, but also a very sad look at an individual who is sort of writing his own confession. The individual who's narrated in the book is a nameless bureaucrat who is at the end of his life saying, well, whenever I was a bureaucrat and whenever I was living this way, I took only pleasure in exercising the little bit of power I had over other people. Any way I could inconvenience their lives and hurt them made me feel a little bit better about myself. And so it's, again, the idea of power and those, the power politics of just little personal reactions. Again, very, very bizarre, but also very human in a way. The Idiot is the story of a fictional prince. And the idea is that this prince is supposed to show how Christ might be encountered if Christ was to come back today. And so again, it's dated by our standards, but at that time it would have been a modern telling of how would Christ be encountered today. There's an individual character who's supposed to be very innocent and very good and pure-hearted in a way similar to how we would understand Christ to be. And he is, of course, has a great deal of trouble getting his message across and interacting with people in the world today. There's a lot of comparison here with Brave New World, we talked about a couple of weeks ago, where again, an individual who is not well suited to today's world ends up in conflict with the values of the world. Again, as we expect Christ's values to be in conflict with the values of the world. And again, we'll circle back on that before the end as well. The book Demons is something that's maybe not as well known. It's about a small village that becomes politically radicalized and the pain and suffering that come from that. Again, Dostoevsky knew individuals and was familiar with individuals who were part of his circle, who were political radicals. And early on in his life, he might have shared some of those same sentiments. By the end of his life, he was actively rebuking them and saying this is not the right way to go. And we'll get into what his argument actually was here in just a little bit. But again, he is saying that this only leads to suffering, and this, you might think you're standing up for something great, but it's just going to take advantage of you and turn you into something that you don't want to be, which is why it's titled Demons, that you're turning into this sort of demon. The Brothers Karamazov is probably his most famous work, tied probably with Crime and Punishment. Most people know him through those two works. It's the extended portrait of a family that is imploding. This family has 4 sons. Each of the sons are meaning something and illustrating a different point of view and a different way of viewing God, of viewing truth, of viewing life. Each of them have their own viewpoints. And again, their conflict with each other illustrates most of the novel. They don't really get along, and they argue in ways to illustrate their own preferred view of life, which shows us, again, what does the truth mean and what does the truth end up being at the end. So again, that definitely deserves its own presentation, but we don't necessarily have time to deal too much with that today. So looking at Crime and Punishment, the work that we're actually going to dig into tonight to explore, again, Dostoevsky, the time he was living in, and what his argument was. So it was written in 1866, again, towards the earlier part of the second half of his career after he's come back from Siberia. He is arguing against something that we call Russian nihilism. Now, again, the term Russian nihilism is a later phrase that we've added to this argument and this school of thought that would have been very popular, especially in St. Petersburg in Dostoevsky's time. Now, again, nihilism means the belief in nothing. Nihil, I believe in nothing. So the idea that the old system is failing, the old system of values is falling apart, and so now we, as we as nihilists, have the freedom to institute our own values. In Crime and Punishment, this is exactly what the main character does. Again, it is not so much a novel about investigation. It is not so much a novel even about crime. There is really a singular big crime that's committed. And we'll go through the plot here really quick. If you haven't read the book, it's actually pretty easy to follow along. There's a main character, and his name is Rodion Raskolnikov. And again, we might think that that's for rascal, like a rascally individual. That's fun and easy to remember, but that's not so much why he's named, and we'll get into what his name more like means in just a little bit. But he is crippled by poverty. He is a former law student. He has dropped out of school. He's living in the really sad apartment. He barely has even one change of clothes. His life is awful. And so he turns to crime, the worst crime. He turns to murder. He knows a pawnbroker who lives across the street from him. He knows that she has a large sum of money, and she is just a really unhappy individual. He doesn't think anybody will miss her. And so he says, I will kill her, take the money, and so I'll improve my own fortune in life. I'll go ahead and spoil the book for you. He does it. He does kill this individual. He also kills her sister, who happens to come back into her apartment. Very awful, awful crime. How can we possibly progress with this character? And how is he the main character of the story, this terrible guy? Well, the rest of the story is dealing with how this individual can rejoin society, how he can become human again after doing this terrible thing, and his interaction with the other characters that we'll get into in just a little bit. So the actual criminal investigation really barely features. Raskolnikov is not a good criminal. He gets figured out by the police almost immediately, and we'll get into what the police investigator is and what he does in just a little bit. He takes most of the novel and takes a step back and says, I want you to confess, and I want you to understand why that what you did was wrong. And so again, that idea that it's not about, the Columbo or Monk or whoever police procedure, like trying to take down this mastermind criminal. It's who is this bumbling, inept criminal who did something awful, and now we need to find out why he did it and how that society, I guess, as both him and the individuals around him, can heal after this. So it's, again, much more psychological and much less, police procedural that some people might be looking at. So again, something of note is that individuals today sometimes even will support Raskolnikov's actions, that first murder. The idea that there is someone who has money and they don't deserve it, and they're not even a good person. So I should be able to take it from them. So again, that's when you get into this nihilism that Dostoevsky is really arguing against. Now, this viewpoint of the world is really popular with young people again, those Russian nihilists, very popular student movement at the time. But it hasn't really faded. Again, the idea of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism just means I'm trying to make the most people happy. So again, what does that mean? What does the most people mean? And what does happy mean? All questions that Dostoevsky starts to probe out here in this work. The quote that I wanted to really take a look at here is, don't we all think ourselves Napoleons? Napoleon is not in the novel. He's not a character. His conquest and his life is already concluded well before this, but he features prominently because he illustrates the idea of an individual who seizes control of destiny, and Raskolnikov thinks of himself as a Napoleon, and this is the answer. Doesn't everybody think that they are Napoleon? So again, you are the most important person to yourself. You know every second of your own life. You've seen the world only from behind your own eyes. But that's different for every single one of us. Every single one of us is a different individual. And so again, Raskolnikov's thesis that I am the most important. What happens when you get an entire room full of people who say that I am the most important? Then we're going to have problems. And so that is what Dostoevsky is looking through. Let's look at the world of this novel. Again, we are not living in 1860s Russia, so let's get some of the background as to the backdrop that Raskolnikov is inhabiting, he and his family and his friends. So serfdom is still very much looming large in Russian society, in just the same way that it was extremely painful process for America to blow itself apart in a civil war to rid ourselves of the evils of slavery. Russia did not really have a war to remove slavery, but the process was extremely slow, and the serfs were extremely slow to be liberated and to be granted full rights. Serfdom is almost identical to slavery. There's this one or two cutouts that kind of give people the idea that it's not really slavery. It's more or less the same thing. The serfs were considered part of the property that they worked on, and they were not allowed to leave. So you might say, well, look at them. They have jobs. They're working in the fields. It's fine. They are restrained from leaving ever, from taking any other job. They're considered part of the land they worked on. And again, in 1861, so just 5 years before this novel is even published, the serfs were emancipated. And again, granted full rights, but these are people who have had no access to education, no access to individual rights, and then again, finally are able to rejoin society. And so the idea of very limited social mobility for a huge swath of your population is something that features very largely. What does someone do when they feel that it's hopeless? We'll put your nose to the grindstone and work hard. We'll say that to the serfs, and they'll laugh at you. They have no hope of moving forward. So what happens when Raskolnikov, again, the main character, also feels, I have no hope of moving forward? Then he starts to become unhinged. The Tsar and the Russian Orthodox Church. The church features very heavily, but not so much in the sense of the actual institution in the novel. The Russian Orthodox Church is the means by which that the Russian state sort of has a state religion. There is a space allowed for other religions in the Russia of this time and the Russia of today. But again, it is very much a powerful political organization, more so maybe even today. But at the time, very much so too. And we'll get into something with them on the next slide. But again, the Russian Orthodox Church doesn't even have a single church service conducted in the novel. The individuals who are the priests and the priestly caste, yes.
Requiem.
I guess, yeah, there is a funeral service. So whenever the priestly class shows up, it's usually just a quick intrusion to say a few inept lines, and then they leave. So what's much more the focus of the novel is the individuals who believe very much so in Christ and believe very much so as Christians. So individual belief versus an institutional faith, even though Dostoevsky was very much in favor of the institutional faith of the Russian Orthodox Church. So again, also hand in hand with this is the idea of the Tsar. Again, the Tsar is again, their word all the way down from where Caesar becomes Tsar, the idea of that father figure for the whole country, the embodiment of your nation, but also completely removed from you. In America, we have this idea that, well, maybe the president could be from anywhere, it could be anyone, could be any one of us. And that's not really true, but it is in a way. And so here, that idea does not exist. There is this father figure, but it will never be you. It can never be you. And he is remote. And so if your will doesn't align with his, then you end up in Siberia. So again, very different. St. Petersburg, also something that we might not think of as like a New York City Wild Wild West in terms of individualism and philosophy, but at this time, very much so it was. Very much so it was something that was attractive to individuals who were seeking to invest in business, people who were traveling. If foreigners moved to Russia, my understanding is that this is probably where they would end up. So very much a cosmopolitan city and something with a lot going on. And again, a hotbed of these new philosophical ideas, among them that young school of Russian nihilism that Dostoevsky is starting to zero in on. So again, we'll circle back on this towards the end. We're getting the philosophy of the characters, but just keep that in mind. Again, you have the worldly characters who believe everything is permitted and I just need to act. And then you have Dostoevsky who is saying we need to put some brakes on this. So the tension between those two gives us most of the content of the novel. Another group of individuals who barely figure in this novel are the old believers. And this is kind of something that we don't have a great analogy to in the West, but there is a section of the Russian Orthodox Church that did not respond well to a series of their reforms, and they sort of separated themselves. And the separation is called the Rascal between the Russian Orthodox Church and what they would call the old believers, the individuals who did not embrace the reforms. And so this features very prominently the idea of individuals who hold very intense, very to them, true religious beliefs and act on them as if they were acting on truth. So for these individuals, a religious belief is not like a handbag that you can take as a decoration. It is something that has to define who you are. So whether or not you agree with them and whether or not Dostoevsky agrees with them, they're very interesting. One of the characters in the novel falsely confesses to the crime for Raskolnikov because he thinks that to confess and to suffer alone is a good thing. So again, very dramatic, and not so much that that's a good idea or something that Dostoevsky is putting forward as something we should all do, but the idea being that, again, these are people who take their faith extremely seriously, even to the point of being kicked out of society. The idea of being walled off from society is something else we need to take a look at because, again, the main character, Raskolnikov, sort of walls himself off by his actions. And again, look here at the name, Rascal. Rascal means division. Now, with the original Russian title of Crime and Punishment, it doesn't mean as much as we would have in the English, where it's a physical crime and they go into prison. It meant something more like a sinfulness or a transgression. Again, a going over or a crossing over against society. So the idea of that division is still there. Misery and expectations. This is a really common theme that we'll dig into whenever we get more into the text, but almost all of the characters, sadly, in Crime and Punishment are very unhappy individuals. Very few of them are having a good time. And this is a very tough time in all of these characters' lives. But we have to examine why that is. What is it that makes a person happy? What is it that makes them unhappy? A lot of this comes from expectations, and we'll get into that again, self as Napoleon idea in just a little bit. But again, think of what makes you happy. Think of the times that you've been disappointed. Is it something that comes out of the blue? I mean, if you were to get a notice right now that your tax refund didn't go through, and you say, well, I haven't even filed my taxes yet. I wasn't expecting that. You wouldn't necessarily be sad. But if you had been counting everything, making sure everything was correct, you filed your taxes and you know they're right, and then they say, yeah, your paperwork wasn't right. We say, well, that's not right. And so you were expecting something, and now you're disappointed because of it. This is also measured to how you imagine yourself. So if I was to go and play basketball with LeBron James, and I was to score 0 points, and he scored 100 points, would I feel bad? No, because my ability is non-existent versus him. He was paid millions of dollars to be very good at the sport. Now, if I went and I scored 99 points against LeBron James, he would be kind of worried and embarrassed. Again, the perception of this is who I am and this is how I should be performing versus reality. It's where a lot of the tension in this story comes from. So the idea that you have, again, the idea of yourself versus the real self. And we'll get into that in just a little bit again. Now, the elimination of misery is something that the utopians would have believed. We talked about utopian beliefs a little bit 2 weeks ago with Brave New World and with 1984. Individuals who think that I'm going to help society by removing this misery. Dostoevsky doesn't really think that that's a great idea because, again, you get some very dangerous beliefs out of people who not only think they're trying to help, but they think they're trying to help to the utmost. If someone thinks they're trying to help, but they're making things worse, maybe it's hard to discourage them because they think they're helping. Well, what happens if you get someone who thinks they're helping the most and that anything is worth their help? Again, very, very dangerous people indeed. And we'll get to that in just a little bit too. This is sort of an illustration that I have of what I think to be part of Dostoevsky's thesis here. And his final thesis ends up looking a little bit like this, where you have an individual, if you think of like in mathematics, you have the input output machine, where if I put in, the number 2 into equation, it spits out 2 times 2. And so I get 4. So no matter what comes in, a certain thing can come out. We expect that. So he looks at individuals who are, again, kind of unhinged from the church. They're unhinged from society. They are miserable, sad people. Well, what happens when misery gets put in on them? You have these individual acts of misery where they get robbed, something bad happens to them, someone is mean to them. Well, misery comes out. These individuals who have miserable things are done to, they turn around and act miserably towards other people. And so it spirals out of control. And very quickly, you have a novel full of people who are very sad. Well, what happens if you change that? What happens in Dostoevsky's view if you make all these individuals Christians who make it their mission to reflect Christ all the time, always? He has one character in his novel, who we'll get to in just a second, who lives that way. No matter what is done to this woman, she makes it her mission to reflect Christ to the best of her ability. And again, even whenever she doesn't do that extremely well, she's still trying intensely hard. Where you get sort of a hard stop on the spiral. You get individuals who are treated abominably by people around them, by society, people who don't fit in, people who don't like the lot they were given in life. But that doesn't matter. The output changes to only reflecting Christ and being good, loving people to those around them. So again, the entire relationship in a society has changed. So this is Dostoevsky's endpoint. We're kind of skipping to the end here. We'll circle back and show our work here a little bit. But Dostoevsky is arguing that the only possible utopia that can be achieved, and the only way you can really have change, is for everyone to become a Christian. Now, obviously, if you don't share Christian beliefs, you might take an argument with that. But again, he's looking at a society where people are in agreement with each other, are able to work together. And again, from his point of view, that would happen under the umbrella of the Russian Orthodox Church. But for us here, let's take a look at it differently. I mean, have you ever gotten an argument where you would say, well, this would just be so much easier if we could just, pray together. And if they were in the church, I don't think we'd be arguing like this. Well, again, that cuts both ways. Again, we treat people maybe differently. If they're from our congregation, or if we're friends with them, maybe they would treat us differently in the same way. So again, reaching that understanding and reflecting Christ at all times, definitely a worthy goal. And again, even if Dostoevsky's umbrella doesn't make much sense to us, the Russian Orthodox Church, we are still able to take his thesis and say, am I reflecting Christ in this moment? Could I be? Should I be? The answer there is yes. No matter who you are, where you are, should I be reflecting Christ? The answer is always yes. This is something that I want to get into just a little bit, that shows that Dostoevsky was not only had his finger on the pulse of Russia at his time, he was looking ahead. Again, the idea of Russia under communism, we won't dwell on this too much, but when you look at a society that was unplugged from religion for the better part of a century, what happens here, this is another Russian individual, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who himself was also exiled to Siberia for his literary works, was writing towards the end of his career as well, had this to say. He said, more than half a century ago, while I was still a child, I recall hearing a number of the older people offer the following explanation for the great disasters that had befallen Russia. Men had forgotten God. That's why all this had happened. So he's talking about the numerous catastrophes of the communist world. So again, a complete reversal of Dostoevsky's thesis. We should at all times reflect God. These individuals saying, well, we should at all times toe the party line, reflect the state, and you see the misery that comes. So Solzhenitsyn continues. Since then, I've spent well on 50 years working on the history of our revolution. And in the process, I have read hundreds of books, collected hundreds of personal testimonies, and have already contributed 8 volumes of my own toward the effort of clearing away the rubble left by that upheaval. But if I were asked today, and again, he's talking in 1983, to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause of the ruinous revolution that swallowed up some 60 million of our people, I could not put it more accurately than to repeat, men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. This is a century after Dostoevsky has died. And again, the idea that once a society becomes completely unplugged from God, there is no stopping this endless spiral. The misery input, misery output has no end. And so again, people will lean on anything to try and stop it, the state, popular culture, any sort of distraction in the form of entertainment, anything to stop it, but there is no stopping it. You need that backdrop. So again, Dostoevsky was very much prescient on that as well. Let's break down the novel and get into the characters. There are a ton of characters. A lot of them only feature maybe infrequently. All of them are very important, but these are the main ones that we'll be taking a look at. Again, their names are a little fun to say too. The first is Raskolnikov. Raskolnikov, again, is our murderer. He has a thesis of the self as this grand figure. He commits that murder, and again, he has to wrestle with that through the entire book. And the book doesn't end until he can conclude what I did was wrong, and this is how I can make it right. So the entire book is his struggle. Now, he doesn't really speak very much on his own. He, as a character, is prompted by the other characters to defend what he did, explain what he's doing, and sort of interact with them. So the others push him and show themselves in their interactions with Raskolnikov. We also get an idea of who he was before the book took place. We get the idea that he used to be a good person. He was a law student. He was doing good work. He got along well with everybody. So by the time we see him in the novel, he's at the lowest point in his life. His life has already fallen apart. So again, a very complex character, and we only see a little snapshot of him, and the others sort of fill in the blanks. Alonia Ivanova is the pawnbroker, who again only features in the novel in that she gets hit with an axe. She barely says anything but before that. But again, she is supposed to be the person who is the acceptable sacrifice to make utopia. And again, this is something that factors in whenever you have people talking about utopia. And so you get, well, who cares about them? They're the billionaires. Who cares about them? They're the landowners. Who cares about them? They're the religious minority. Who cares about them? They don't even live here. You get the individuals that it's acceptable to get rid of in order to bring about utopia. And so she is sort of the illustration of that. There is no apology that makes her a good person. We don't see that, well, she secretly gives to the poor. Well, she secretly is a great person on the inside. There's no explanation. We don't think that she's a good person. Does that make it okay to kill her? Absolutely not. And so again, the individual is still a human who needs to be treated with respect. Dunya is Raskolnikov's sister. There is some really bad timing for him. While he's trying to deal with the fallout of committing a murder, his family shows up to town. But his mother and his sister show up to sort of talk with him and greet him and go through their lives, and they are able to interact with him and try to figure out what's happening in real time as he's struggling with it. So there's a lot of high tension moments there as well. This is interesting. His sister is engaged to a really kind of lame character. The lawyer Luzin is just a lecherous man. He just wants to marry Raskolnikov's sister because she's very beautiful, very kind woman. He just wants to take advantage of her, but he is very rich. Now, Raskolnikov, even in his flailing mental state, recognizes this isn't right. You can't be doing this. And so, of course, you have that great irony where he says, I need money to better myself and my family. I'm going to commit murder. And in his mind, he says, well, that's okay. His sister says, I need money to benefit myself and my family. I'm going to marry this guy that I don't really like. And then he turns around and says, well, you can't do that. And so again, you have that tension there. And you see how they kind of proceed from there. They end up not getting married. It's a happy ending for her. I'll spoil that for you. But again, we'll go through her in just a little bit. Sonia is probably the secondary protagonist of the story. Very important character. Very early on, Raskolnikov encounters a drunk former law clerk. Whenever I was first reading this book, I was also a clerk at the state house, and so I thought that was a little funny. But again, he encounters a drunk law clerk who is lamenting how his family has come to ruin. Because of that conversation, he seeks out Sonia. Sonia is forced to become a prostitute to support her family because her failure of a father has drunk away all of their money. So again, you have that tension, and he sees in her another sort of kindred spirit. And he says, oh, well, you're also have been forced into doing these drastic actions. Aren't we the same? And she demonstrates to him, no, we aren't the same, because even though you've given yourself entirely over to the self and everything is permissible to achieve that selfishness that you want, she only acts as a Christian, only tries to live as a Christian. So we'll get into how that looks in just a little bit. Razumikin is Raskolnikov's former fellow student. They were students together. So it's through him that we see who Raskolnikov used to be, and he usually shows up to move the story along and explain things a little bit. He is an interesting character, and again, shows what a more normal person looks like in comparison to Raskolnikov. So he keeps us a little bit grounded, and we say, well, what would a normal person do in this scenario that's more Razumikin? And so he keeps the novel a little bit grounded, and so not everyone is crazy, as it were. The couple characters we want to touch on before we move on. Svidrigailov is very interesting. Svidrigailov used to be the boss of Dunya Raskolnikov's sister. He is emblematic of the upper classes. Everybody in this novel has no money. Everybody in this novel can barely even afford one pair of shoes to walk outside. Svidrigailov is different because he has nearly limitless resources. Throughout the entire novel, every scene that he's in, he hands people money, he's buying insane things, he's giving people ludicrous amounts of cash for no reason. It embarrasses them. They don't know how to interact with him. He is used to getting his way through his money. And what's shown with him is that he doesn't really care what happens as long as he has ownership over it. So he is showing an upper class who only knows how to proceed when they're in charge. There's a scene where a woman draws a gun on him and starts to shoot him. She tries to shoot him and misses. And he tells her, reload your gun and try again. And then he sits down because he's okay with being shot at as long as he can be the one who actually tells her, yeah, go ahead and do that. So even being shot in the head, he doesn't get shot in the head. Well, even getting shot in the head, it only proceeds with his permission. And so again, a really, really bizarre character. And sort of a different vector of Raskolnikov's line of thought, where I have to be in charge. And whereas Raskolnikov has no money to back it up, Svidrigailov has all the money to back it up. So very interesting kind of contrast there. Porfiry Petrovich is the police investigator who is supposed to find out who killed the old pawnbroker. He happens to be in town and so proceeds with the investigation. Again, some people who I think maybe didn't read the book would describe him as like, well, he's this Columbo figure. He's the mastermind investigator. Not so much.
No, he's much better dressed. He probably looks a little bit like Hercule Poirot.
Yes, yeah, maybe.
He smokes.
Maybe so. And so he, again, is a different sort of individual, but it's not really about his investigation. As soon as he questions Raskolnikov freaks out, can't handle it. He has a fainting fit. So, of course, the police say, well, this guy probably did it. And so through most of the novel, he knows who the murderer is. But his argument is it's better for us and it's better for you if you know why what you did was wrong and then you explain yourself and you confess. So that is most of the novel is Raskolnikov wrestling with that. And Porfiry Petrovich, he has to do something eventually. He can't just let a murderer walk free. So he will arrest him, but he doesn't want to. He wants him to confess. So that gives us sort of the ticking clock for the novel that we get into. Katerina Marmeldova is Sonya's mother, and she isn't really a main character, but she's fantastically interesting because she was raised in a rich household and then was reduced to poverty that, again, forced Sonya into becoming a prostitute. So she feels very much guilty about that, but she's also clinging to her memory of living that almost aristocratic life of when she was a girl. So again, it's illustrating that sort of lifestyle too, and very sad individual, but also why do people cling to that? Why do people enjoy that sort of life? So very much interesting there. So again, a lot of people to keep up with, but again, the important ones that we want to follow are Raskolnikov, the actor of the self, Sonya, the actor who's trying to follow Christ, and then the others who are sort of observing their conversations with each other. So you gave this for being maybe a little on the nose, but I've divided this up into two sections, crime and punishment. Crime being action, the action of the individual, and punishment being reaction. So whenever you take an action, what is taken against you as the punishment, as it were. So with crime, we're going to look at desire and self-perception. Why do people act at all? Why do people take drastic actions? It's because you can see yourself somewhere that you aren't currently. People go to school, they go to college because I can see myself being a lawyer, and I have to take the action of going to law school, even if I don't enjoy the classes, if I want to be a lawyer. Next, we get self-ideation. This goes beyond self-perception, where I can see myself doing something, but this is the ideal self. And moreover, this is something that, a phrase that's kind of scary to me, the world as it should be. Again, you have an idea of this is what the perfect world would look like, and this is my role in it. And again, the very dangerous individuals who think, well, I can bring about the perfect world if only I do this. And again, where does that end up? And finally, self-restraint. So this is what it takes to make someone act and to propel someone into action. How are we different? What makes someone not act, and what holds them back whenever they're trying to hold back their actions? Finally, punishment, society speaking. The idea that everything that we do gets a reaction. Again, if you're speaking to a group and you say something that people don't like, and they just frown at you, or maybe they just don't understand. If you tell a joke and it doesn't go over well, people don't laugh. The idea that everything is a constant give and take between you and your audience, even if you're only talking to one person. Everything is social in that way. Rebellion, what happens if you're cut off from society and you're walled off in the way that the old believers were, and in the way that Raskolnikov is for most of the novel. And then finally, redemption. The novel hinges on redemption and the ability of an individual to redeem themselves. So how can we have that? And is that something we can have? And again, how we know we can have it as Christians? How can we explain that to society around us? So let's first look at crime, the ability of an individual to act. So with self-perception, again, almost every single character we talked about had a dream to be something else, but was compelled to become a different reality, and they're very unhappy about it. Sonia was studying history and was studying to be something else, and ended up having to become a prostitute. Raskolnikov, again, was in law school, was decently successful as a law student, and had to drop out because he couldn't keep on paying his tuition. Dunya obviously wants to marry someone that she actually loves and has to have this engagement to this unsavory lawyer character. Everybody wants something and they can't have it. And again, you have that anxiety whenever you are disconnected from what you want to be. So what does that force you to do? Again, what is your actual goal? For Raskolnikov, it's the self. For Sonia, it's serving the Lord. And so again, the first inkling of difference that he has in between himself as Raskolnikov, the main character, and Sonia, again, as the individual who's trying to serve God and live as a Christian, is that he says that she doesn't have the same despair as he does. So again, something is different about her. And so again, if you are a Christian, that rock bottom isn't really rock bottom. It's not completely irrelevant. We still feel bad for other people suffering, and we'd still rather people not suffer. We do what we can to help them. But again, are you ever really at rock bottom if you're a Christian? And we'll look at that in just a little bit. But what is the self? This is just a quick illustration. I wanted to show this just to show, again, what the kind of stakes were for the idea of the individual. And this will get into a point we have in just a second. So this is the first French Empire in 1799. This is whenever Napoleon ascends to the throne. Again, Raskolnikov talks about frequently in the novel himself as Napoleon. Well, something he says to Sonia is, what if Napoleon was on Corsica and he had to kill one old pawnbroker, just like I did, to get the money to start? Do you think he would have stopped? No. And then she rebuffs him and says, that's still wrong. It doesn't matter. But again, you have the temptation that here is the self and here's what you can do. You have the self who conquered half of the world. And so this is something where it's kind of a little example I have here. But again, think about the real lives that are impacted by this. I mean, there are people who here, we live in a free country, our own country, and here now we live in France. This has real impact on the world whenever individuals take up the reins for themselves. Now, again, you can think of that feeling of triumph. I founded my own business. I made a good deal. I did something great. I said something that people enjoyed. Everyone laughed at my joke. That feeling of triumph, again, Napoleon is happy there. The idea that you are fulfilled. Now, why do people chase that? And again, what's the fallout from that? So with self-perception, something I did want to touch on really quickly is, again, what does this look like today for us? Do we still have Napoleons? Again, there is currently an individual who's destabilizing most of world politics in pursuit of his vision of the world. Very timely. Are there other individual Napoleons in our lives? Everyone has interacted with someone who's a boss at a business. And no matter how low level they might be, they feel they have power over people. It impacts their relationships with other people. And again, we have people today who identify themselves as influencers on social media, and they talk about how many followers they can amass. Again, the idea that you are trying to show yourself as someone to be followed. What does that look like? Self-ideation is a little bit different. Again, you get where the idea of yourself is not only something that you are the most important person, but that you approach a perfect person. This is very scary. And individuals who look at themselves in this way are very bizarre. Again, you get Svidrigailov, who is the very rich individual we talked about. He cannot even fathom self-failure. He cannot even imagine a world where he can't have what he wants because he's so used to being able to purchase everything from everyone. So whenever he's confronted with that failure, he completely becomes unglued. And so he is, again, completely unable to reconcile himself to reality. These people are not living in reality. They don't even really think of themselves as human anymore. All of us know that we've sinned. We've all made mistakes. These individuals don't. So again, Raskolnikov never really goes this far. Now he teases at it, but he never goes this far. He knows that he is messed up, but he has to figure out why over the course of the novel. Finally, self-restraint. Self-restraint is the ability to not act, the ability to see that perfect world in your head and dismiss it. Now, we exercise self-restraint a billion times a day. Driving the speed limit. I would like to get to my appointment on time, but I don't want to break the law. Now, what's very interesting, again, is the interplay between do you follow that or do you break that? And how important does the action have to be to cause you to break what set of values? So again, breaking the speed limit to get to a doctor's appointment. If it's just a checkup, fine. If someone's broken their arm and you're driving them to the hospital, all of a sudden the speed limit becomes maybe not so much a consideration. You put your hazards on and just drive. So what causes an individual to have self-restraint? What causes them to respect society? And then what causes them to move beyond that? So again, Raskolnikov doesn't really have any laws that he respects. He commits, again, the ultimate crime of murder. He doesn't respect the law. He doesn't respect God's law. So what sort of respect do they need to instill in him and value for others in order to completely regain himself? At the very end of the novel, and this is literally the last 2 pages of the book, he only really has healing whenever he realizes that Sonia is sick and that he thinks that, well, what if she died? What would I do then? He feels extremely broken by that possibility, realizes that he values and loves her, and that is when he's able to become a human being again. He realizes he's able to value other people. So again, maybe you drive the speed limit because you respect the law and you don't want to get a ticket, but also because you don't want to hurt anybody else from driving very fast. That's a very small example, but it's also, I think, a very true example. Looking very quickly at punishment, the idea that society also has an argument here. With Porfiry Petrovich, Porfiry wants what's best for society. Again, he's the investigator character. And he says it's better for everyone if you confess because, again, you are going to show that you are able to be a good Russian and you're able to make what's best for all of us. This is, again, utilitarianism, the idea that I want the most people to be the most happy. And that can be very cold, or it can be, in this case, again, warm, and that you're caring for each person.
Yeah, but Porfiry definitely has a religious motive.
Oh, yes, yeah. And so this character is not really the example that I make of him. He has more depth. We don't really have time to get too much into him. But again, the individuals who act positively in this book are doing so for religious reasons, which is something that is, again, very much to be complimented. But again, there is a societal argument. Again, whenever you do something, if you paint your house a color that people don't like, people might come and talk to you. Your action has a reaction in society. Something we'll look at in one of our discussion questions maybe is, how do we let this affect us as Christians? If we have a law that we cannot break and self-restraint that we cannot break, then does society even get a vote in what we do? The answer is most likely no, but do we take into account any of their criticism of our beliefs then, or do we completely separate it from society in that way? That gets into rebellion. Just as the old believers were separate and they lived on the fringe of society, again, Raskolnikov is living on the fringe of society in that same way. He feels cut off from his family, cut off from his friends. The police are on his tail. Nobody wants to interact with him and claim him, and so he feels really isolated. That isolation gives you the anxiety that dominates most of the novel, and again, he has to overcome that and rejoin society. There's a lot that we could get into here if we had a little more time. Specifically with Soren Kierkegaard, he's a Danish existentialist philosopher. He was talking about the idea that Christians and people are instinctively both maybe a little interested in and distrustful of crowds. Any group of people make an argument. There are some people who say, well, that must be true. So many people are saying it. And there are other people who say, in the opposite way, so many people are saying that can't be true. And so you have two kind of opposite things. So again, how much do we value society, and should society have a vote in how we act? And then finally, redemption, the idea that you can come back in to life. We'll talk about this more in just 1 second here as we wrap up. Again, Dostoevsky was hoping for that redeemed society that he outlined, the idea that people might have misery inflicted upon them, but they wouldn't do it to other people. And so in that way, you're able to lift all of society out of misery and become better people. As we wrap up, let's look at the Christian response. Again, we have maybe not the umbrella of a church organization, but we do have our own individual families, we have our congregations, and we have obligations to them. We love and we honor them, and we do our best to treat them with respect and to honor them as individuals and as Christians. But beyond that, every single person is a beautiful, unique creation, a son or daughter of God, and they absolutely deserve that respect. And there are lines that cannot be crossed. So again, with the murder of the old woman, it is completely irrelevant that no one likes her. It's completely irrelevant that she wasn't doing anything good with her money. You cannot kill her. That is not something you can do. And that line can never be crossed. Something I do want to look at here, F.A. Hayek wrote a book called The Road to Serfdom, and it's applicable here not only because he's talking about serfs, but because he's talking about people allowing decisions to be made for them by other individuals who are just more motivated. So again, in Raskolnikov, you have an individual who believes very fully and very aggressively in himself, and so he's able to take these actions. Again, imagine that scene of chaos we painted earlier, a society full of Raskolnikovs when he's at his worst. 1 billion people who all think, I am the most important, I should be able to do whatever I want. Everything falls apart almost immediately. So finally, a couple things we want to zero in on before we wrap up here. Self-reflection and introspection. Everyone as a Christian has to evaluate themselves. What am I doing? Am I living in a good way according to the law of the Lord, according to Christ? If I'm not doing that, it's not good. You can't just let yourself go and only let society dictate who you are. Finally, punishment. Again, the world doesn't like that word. The world especially does not like that word in a Christian sense. But again, how else are we supposed to correct ourselves? How else are we supposed to monitor things that are done incorrectly? And if we honor those lines that cannot be crossed, then again, there has to be that punishment or that reaction against any action that transgresses that. And I think that might be something that we might have some time to discuss a little bit later on. And finally, forgiveness. Again, Raskolnikov opens the novel with murdering 2 women with an axe. He closes the novel with being accepted and forgiven and allowed to re-enter society. So does that mean that everyone should be forgiven for everything and that they should be pardoned for every crime or that nobody should have to go to prison? No. But is forgiveness always on the table spiritually? Yes. So again, that is what we want to zero in on, is that if you respect everyone and you hold those lines that cannot be crossed, everybody has to be able to re-enter society and become, again, true to themselves. And that opens up a million other conversations about crime and punishment, about the death penalty, about all sorts of different things. But again, in terms of spirituality and in terms of forgiveness in Christ, that is always part of who we are. Nobody is ever shut out of our church. We don't ever lock away Christ from someone and say, you can never come back. 2 questions that we can think of as we go forward, whether we talk about these or we can just think about them as we go on. But to what extent does individualism create people like Raskolnikov? So American society is very individualistic. We celebrate the individual. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? What makes people like him? Also, how does communal action create Raskolnikov? That's what we talked about 2 weeks ago. Again, the idea that someone who thinks they're making a communal, better world is actually maybe only living out a world that they themselves want to live in. And then finally, in raising children and encouraging each other, how can we escape material measures of success? So Raskolnikov feels acutely how poor he is throughout the entire book. Why should someone's spiritual state be determined by what's in their bank account? Is that a real thing? Do people feel spiritually up or down depending on how much money they have? They shouldn't. How can we help to mitigate that? And so again, how can we get people who feel spiritually whole no matter who they are here in reality? That's really everything I had for tonight. We'll have a little bit of time for question and discussions. I don't want to keep anyone too late, but if anyone has anything, I'd be delighted to roll over everything that I missed. Yeah.
He works really hard to rationalize his idea and justify it, in that paper that ended up getting published. He didn't know it got published, where he justifies the superior people who can make these decisions of conscience.
Yes, and so that's fantastically interesting. For those of you who haven't read the book or who missed that section, one of the key things that tips off the investigator to Raskolnikov's guilt is that whenever he was still a law student, he had an article that was published that really laid out his system of thought, where he said, yeah, you know what, if you really need to transgress the law and do something to achieve something great, there should be exceptions made for that. And this is why I believe that. And so,
but only if you were a superior.
Only if you were a superior person, which again, writing before Nietzsche, gets into Nietzsche's thesis of the Übermensch, the person who is exempt from the laws that govern the lesser people. So again, very interesting that he was prescient on that. Yes.
So he uses this very rationalistic, worldly justification, but after he's done it, instinctively, he has compassion for Marmeladov, the drunk who gets run over by a horse, and takes bleeding Marmeladov to his home, and then throws away his last little bit of money to the family. And so instinctively, he still
knows that
forgotten
he's not
right from wrong.
Yeah, so I think very few people are completely inhumane in that they can't recognize the humanity of others in that way. And so again, Raskolnikov, the character, demonstrates that he is still able to love. And again, that's how he eventually comes back to redemption, is that long road that starts with talking to the drunk character in the bar, ends up with him, loving and valuing his daughter and seeing her as another person who's worthy of his respect. Anyone else have anything? If not, Clay, if you could say a prayer for us to wrap up.
Yeah. God, we thank you so very much for these opportunities, and we thank you for Jordan and his insights and organization and everything, presentation. Appreciate all the different parts of it. Father, we thank you for these authors that we've been able to look at and their works, and Father, help us to, with everything we read and everything we see in the media, everything we see on billboards, help us to evaluate them based on you and your truth. And Father, just help us to be wise. We pray for wisdom. We pray for humility. We pray for good decision making. We pray for good evaluation skills. And Father, we do pray that we'll just be more like Christ each and every day. Help us to be better people. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.